Hello and welcome to another episode of my experience with the Sony A7r4. In this episode I will talk about dynamic range, color and noise between my Canon and the Sony camera. I've done a test in the studio where the light is controlled, and I will do one in the environment one where you will see the true potential of the camera. I've used the settings where they perform the best, so let's get going with the images. First of all, I will go with the right exposure where nothing I've changed, so that you can see the difference between Canon and Sony cameras of the color. First of all, the wood color is washed out on the Sony part and more vibrant and pronounced in the Canon. Well, for me, I do like the Canon one. I think it's more realistic and it's way more better. As you can see here, it's for me it does look way more great on the Canon. Of course, it has a little bit of magenta, and Sony I see some green. But let's go with on the red colors. Here you can see that the red on the Sony it's more of a orange color and not red. Here on Canon it does show up very good. Maybe it's also the Lightroom profile, but I don't think so. It's close to this. But on the other colors it's kind of very close. The blue, it seems, this is on the Canon on the right. So yeah, it's more pronounced, more vibrant on the Canon than the Sony, but it does look pretty similar, so it's not a big of a deal. But these two colors are very pronounced. Let's get going to see if I can get the Sony camera to look almost the same as the Canon. Well, the red on the Sony now looks a little more closer to the Canon, but still not that very great. But the wood texture is now a little more horrible, not that very good. What I did change on the Sony is, let's go on the Sony. It's increase a little bit of temperature, tint, and also saturation and Adobe Profile Color Vivid. Yeah, you need to do a little more work, and it's not that very perfect with this color, but yeah, you need to do a lot more work to get pretty good color rendering the same as a Canon or other thing. Now it's a little bit more closer, but still the red, it's not that very red, it's still a little bit orange. So yeah, but yeah, I can a little get past with that. It's not that very big of a problem, but yeah, still Sony does not have a good color rendition yet. Now let's go with one stop overexposed to see the dynamic range between Canon and Sony. As you can see here, exposure minus one stop. So let's get to compare them. They do look very similar, but let's get a closer look on the highlights. As you can see here, the highlights on the pen do look very similar, but it started already to get a little bit washed out on the Sony part, the highlights on the book. It seems that the Canon retained more detail, so let's get going on the pot. Here it started to show up that the Sony did lose some detail on the highlights. As you can see here on this little flower, there's not that much of detail around here rather than the Canon. See, it does have a little more detail, and in this part of the flower here you can see the Sony did already lose much more detail, where the Canon retains the same detail as a normal exposure. So yeah, here it's starting to see that the Canon has a better dynamic range on the highlights. So now let's get going with the two-stop overexposed. Here I will show you that the both of them, Sony and the Canon, are -2 overexposed. So yeah, let's get on the right it's the Sony and on the left it's the Canon. and you already see that the Sony lost every detail on the book around here, and the pen did retain its detail, but it does not have that much highlight information. But as you can see, the book already lost a lot of detail. Let's get going on the pot. Here you already see so much detail are lost, and the Canon did retain a lot of detail, like even better than the Sony, where it was underexposed by one stop. So yeah, you have more dynamic range on the Canon on the highlights. With this, as you can see, Sony does not retain detail on the highlights, so you should not ever expose an area where the highlights are dominating. So let's see if the Sony is very good on the shadows, or maybe Canon. Let's see how they perform on the shadow area. Here is one stop underexpose on both of them. This is the Canon one stop, and this is the Sony. Here you can see that they both of them look very similar, not that very much of a difference, or none at all. In the shadow area, no noise at all. Here is the same. I cannot say that much about these two files, because for me it does look very close. Maybe Canon has a little more noise already, but it's not that big of a problem. Here you can see they're pretty clean. Yeah, Canon has a little more noise on the black area, but I will say it's not a big of a problem around here. Both of the files can be used without a problem. Now let's go with two stops underexposed. Here you can see Sony with two stops underexposed, and here is the Canon. So from here you kind of already see a little bit that the Canon already starts to lose not detail, but starts to get a lot more of noise. So let's get going on the shadow area, the same as the first one. Here you can see that the noise is very pronounced on the Canon, and the Sony camera has no noise at all, man. So much information on the shadow area, and without any noise. Also, the Canon do retain the same amount of detail on the shadow area, but it's very noisy. As you can see here, no noise at all on the Sony camera, and the Canon already it's kind of lost the file, because it's very noisy. Also, the detail on both of them are very good. I cannot say anything about that. You already see on the very black as it's on the screen and also on the camera that the noise is very pronounced on the Canon, and on the Sony it's non-existent. So man, it's amazing how what Sony can create on this underexposed image. So I done even on 3 stops underexposed, and let's see how they perform. As you can see here, it's -3 underexposed, and you already saw that what Canon can produce. You already see that the Canon file, it's already broken. You cannot use it at all with this situation. So let's get going on the book. Here you see already that it's destroyed. I mean, it's useless. You cannot use it anywhere. But look at on the Sony, man. I don't know what they've done, but the dynamic range on the black area, it's amazing. You can recover a lot of detail, even if you underexpose by mistakes or something. So yeah, you can use the Sony file even if it's under 3 stops underexposed. I did not try even further, but it's amazing. Also, the Sony does not handle the highlights very good, where the Canon does. So I think it's somehow closer, because yeah, you can expose for the shadows on the Canon and expose for the highlights on the Sony, and you can recover it very good. I always did expose for the shadows when I shot with the Canon, because I know I cannot recover the shadows with the Canon because it's very noisy, as you can see, but I could recover on the highlights very good without a problem. So yeah, on the Sony I shoot reverse. I expose for the highlights always. But yeah, I am amazed with what can Sony produce with this file, and the dynamic range is a lot bigger than the Canon, so I do like it a lot. So this is what I recommend. If you have a Sony, do expose for the highlights, and if you shoot with a Canon, do expose for the shadows. I don't know a newer system like the mirrorless camera from the Canon, but I saw that they're very similar. Still, they do dominate on the highlights area. I know the shadows. Now let's go with the noise area on both of them. Let's go with the 5000 ISO on both of them and see the noise level and how they perform. As you can see already that the Sony did break up. Here is the Sony on the right, Canon on the left. Here you can see the highlights on the Sony and on the Canon, that the Sony did lose detail on the highlights, and here is on the right also. See, the Canon has a lot more detail, even though this detail is kind of weird, and on the Sony it's just blown out, but at least there's still a lot more detail on the Canon. Also the white balance is very different because I've set it on the Sony to be as true white as possible. I don't know what kind of software do they have, but I see that it starts to maintain the white balance very close. And also, as you can see on the first image, that the Sony did have a little more washed out colors and not as pronounced as the Canon. As you can see here on the cables, that the Sony it's destroyed on the highlights. Yeah, the Sony does not reproduce very good the highlights, and the colors also, because of that this happen. And as we can see on a higher noise level, but what we can see on the high ISO level is that the Sony does not handle very good details. The dynamic range is pretty good on both of them, so I cannot complain about that, but the color reproduction, it's not good at all on the Sony, I will say. Yeah, you can get away with this type of problems. There's no point to not using these files, but the Canon has a better I will say it has a better dynamic range on high ISO. Now let's get going with 10,000 ISO. As you can see, it's zoom in on a 42 and 40 millimeters. Yeah, I try to be very close. Here you can see also it's the same. The noise level, I will say that it's very similar. I'm not seeing very much noise on both of them. I will say it's very equal, even though I don't know, I say that the Canon is more sharper on the higher ISO than the Sony, but that might be even the lens, because I might say that the lens from the Canon is way more sharper than the Sony. I don't know, it's better quality on the Canon, the lens. As you can see here, both of them has the best lens they have. So yeah, you can see here, I'm not saying that there's much more noise than the other. I will say it's very pretty similar, even though the Sony has 61 megapixel, which is amazing that it does retain so much control of the noise. Now let's go with the wide angle, because sometimes it does change a little bit how the noise is reproduced on zoom in and wide angle, but I don't think in this situation it does change at all. So on the left it's Canon, on the right it's Sony. And as you can see, there's not much of a difference, it's pretty much the same. So in this situation it didn't change anything. It's amazing that now a 61 megapixel sensor can perform so much better, even though it's a 5D Mark III, so this camera has, I don't know how many years, maybe 10 years. I don't remember when this camera was launched, but it's pretty amazing what it can do. So now let's go and increase the shadow area on both of them and see how they perform. Okay, it's the same as Canon on the left and Sony on the right, but you already see that the Sony has it's a step up, because look at the noise on the Canon. Yeah, the Canon, as you can saw, it does not regain so much detail on the shadow area, even though you can still see pretty good detail on the shadow area on both of them. So I will say that even the Canon is pretty amazing, but it does reproduce way much more noise. Even though the Sony has a lot of noise, I would say that in some areas the Canon do look very good. I mean, here, I would say here the Canon is way much better. Of course, this is in the highlights area, but here the Canon it's way much more worse than the Sony. Even here you can see that the Canon has a lot more noise than the Sony. Yeah, they kind of look very similar and not that much. As you can see here, the Canon is still more sharper than the Sony. Maybe that it's the lens area and not the sensor itself. So yeah, well, here the Canon already lost even some colors, and the Sony did way much better in this situation, but of course it's 10,000 eyes, so it won't even increase the shadows that much, because what's the point if you already have a destroy file with 10,000 with no settings involved, then it's not already worth to use it. Let's decrease the highlights and see how they perform both of them. But already you can see that it's pretty good on the Canon on the right, Sony on the left. As you can see here, the Sony starts to look more closer to the Canon, where it wasn't decrease the highlights area, but here, man, the Canon still regains a lot more details on the highlights. Here, as you can see, the Sony do look pretty close on how the Canon was, and the Canon just looks amazing on the highlights. I mean, I don't know what I could say, but here, even on 10,000 ISO, the Canon still regains way much better highlights detail than the Sony. I don't know, they do perform very well on the highlights. I think it's the only sensor that does perform very good on the highlights area. I don't know from other companies that it's the same. So yeah, this is what I can say about the dynamic range on the Studio for both of the cameras. They're still both amazing, and I do use them, both of them. But of course I do enjoy now a little more of the Sony, because it has more function that I needed, even though I still use the DSLR, the Canon, every day on my professional work. If you do decide to buy one of the system, this is what I recommend, is do expose for the highlights on the Sony camera, because you can increase the shadows and exposure a lot to look very good without any noise problem. And on the Canon, do expose for the shadows, because you can decrease the highlights area without a problem and not losing very much information. And now let's go for some environmental shoots to see how do they perform on somehow a real world experience. With this, let's go and see how did they perform with environmental shots and see which one is more better or which one is not. Maybe it's the same on both of them. Let's start first with some portraits. As you can see here, the Sony does look a little more magenta here and warmer, where the Canon on the right looks pretty good. The white on the door is white, the snow also is very white. It does look way much better on the Canon. Not that much to say, dynamic range looks the same, even though on the Canon side it does look way much more light. I think it's because the door is slightly open than the Sony. Here it is with one stop overexposed. And you already see the horrible skin tones from the Sony. From what you saw in the studio shots, the Sony already lose detail in the highlights with one stop overexposed. And here it does show up that the skin tone does not look very good, at least in this area. It's kind of destroyed right now. Also on the white, the Canon still looks very good, but I won't say that it's a much big of a problem on the white snow rather than on the skin tones. Here is two stops overexposed, and here there is not much to say. It is clear that the Sony lost by a lot. You cannot even use this file. Here the skin tone it's non-existent and the Canon looks very good. On the snow also it's destroyed, it's way too brighter. As you can see on the Canon side there is a little more detail, and on the Sony it's just white, it's nothing there. Here I've decreased the highlights to 100% to see how it is, and as you can see here on Canon side you can still pull up some details on the whites, and on Sony of course it did lost with two stop overexposed, so there's nothing here. Let's go with one stop underexposed and see how it does look. Well, from here it does not show up anything wrong, but let's go on the shadows and you'll already see that the Canon has started to show up its noise problems, where the Sony has no problem with the nose and it does look way much better. But let's go with two stop underexposed. Canon already lost, like when the Sony lost on overexposed images. Let's look at the Sony and we can see that there is detail and also no noise, which is great. Canon also has detail but a lot of noise. Here I increases the shadow and you already see the noise pattern from the Canon, but look at the Sony, there is no noise at all. It does retain every detail, and also the Canon too, but it has a lot of noise, so the file cannot be used. Well, you can see just a little bit the noise from the Sony, but that's not important at all. I made some small edits on the proper exposed one, and let's see how it does look. Well, for now it does look pretty good, but let's zoom in and look at the Canon side. There's a little bit of noise around here, and on the Sony everything does look very good. The highlights, there is detail in highlights, even though I see more detail in highlights on the Canon, but also more noise on the shadows from the Canon. So here the Sony does look very good. But let's go with one stop overexposed on the Canon and let's see how it does look. You already see that the noise is non-existent on the Canon side, and detail on the highlights and everything, it does look very good. So yeah, it's way more better to overexpose by a little the Canon side, so that it will be equal with the Sony and other things. Well, it will look way much better than the previous one, so that's why I always kinda overexposed by a little on the Canon side. Now I'm not saying that here the Canon is way much better, because you need to overexpose by one stop to look good from like on the Sony, and that it does not work very good every time. I will show you in the next setup that even by one stop or two stop overexposed, it's still not very good. Even in this situation, I will still say that the Sony won, even though its color it's not that very good. You have to adjustment for this, but its dynamic range looks pretty good. Now let's try something more extreme, and it's the landscape area where the dynamic range matter. Here is a proper exposed image. There is a little difference between light and composition, but this won't make a difference on the final output. I've increased the shadows on both of them, and let's see what is happening. Where Canon is a little bit brighter, but let's zoom if you already cannot see the problem. As you can see, Canon is full of noise and the image can be used, and for the Sony everything looks good. Still, Canon, I will say, it has the same shadow detail and as the Sony with lots of noise. Now I've decreased the highlights on both of them. Like you did know from previous images, Canon has a lot more information on the highlights, and here it does show up very good, where Sony already lost a lot of information on the highlights. Even though on the clouds here, around here, looks very good, but here on the brighter part it's already lost. Of course, it's not that very big of a problem. Now you already saw that the Sony part it's way much more underexposed. It's something that the Sony files do on the highlights. It drops by a lot the exposure, but I will go to expose properly like the Canon is. Well, it did underexpose by almost one stop, and you can see here it's closer to the Canon, but still it does not matter because the highlights are destroyed, and when you increase the exposure it will be lost even more. But now let's go with one stop overexposed. I already decreased the highlights and increased the shadows on both of them. I will keep the exposure with minus one stop because this is a proper one stop overexposed, so I won't interfere with other things. Sony on the left, Canon on the right. Well, I already see that Sony lost a lot of detail in the highlights, and Canon still managed to bring a lot of details, but on the shadow part Canon still looks noisy. Even though it's not that very much, it still has some weird colors around its noise area. Now with two stops overexposed, you already see the problems. Sony did lose everything in the highlights. Canon does look the same as the Sony file where it was proper exposed, which, yeah, it does not look very good, but not that very bad though. But let's go on the shadows, and Canon does look very good on the shadow part, and also the Sony too. Even though, like I said, Sony do underexpose by a lot when you decrease the highlights. It does look very good on the shadow part, but look at this last detail. Man, the Sony lens is not sharp at all. See the distortion around here. It's very soft. Even in the center it's very soft. Now this is on the corner, but it does not look sharp at all. Let's go in the center. Well, around here I will say it's closer to the center, and still it's horrible, man. It's not sharp even at 7.1 f-stop. But let's go back to the dynamic range. Well, to have a Canon look good in the shadows and not that very good in the highlights, it does need a two-stop overexposed image to look the same as the Sony when it was proper exposed. Here is the Sony shot at a proper exposure, and it does look similar, but it does show up that the Canon has a little more blown out highlights, but it might be the ambient light changing, so I will say this one looks very similar. But it does not benefit Canon to shoot two-stop overexpose for this situation. Even though with a filter you can use it very good, but also with a filter you can use it on the Sony. Let's go with one stop underexposed. Well, I don't think there is a point going much further. Canon lost in this situation, but I do love the dynamic on the Sony, so let's go with two stop underexposed and see how good does the Sony file look. Here is with two stop underexposed. Of course, I kept the highlights and shadows on maximum, even though shadows on Canon is dropped. You already see the noise pattern. Now here Sony does look kinda the same when the Canon was at the proper exposure in highlights. Let's see the shadow area where it does show up a little bit of noise, but with this we can see how much we can recover from a Sony file. Here is the Canon at a proper exposure, and yeah, you already see that those Sony files look very similar to the Canon one, even though it has a little more blown up area. Maybe the light change it by a little, so I will say it's very similar. Now I've made an HDR for the Canon with 3 stops difference on the files, and from the Sony with a 3 stop underexposed file, no HDR. From what you can see, they look very similar. Highlights and shadow, there's everywhere detail in the file. But let's go on the shadow part. Now for the shadow part, Sony starts to break up, lost a little detail in the black area, but Canon do compete with Sony, where Canon does look very good, but we have an HDR file with 3 stops exposure difference, and Sony just 1 file, and to look like this, it does say a lot on how good the Sony dynamic range is. Also, here is an extreme comparison, but with a good edit, there will be no problem with this detail lost. And of course, the noise won't be showing up that much. Now for fun, I made an HDR file for Sony, also with the same 3 stop exposure difference, and you already see there is no difference in the files at all. They do look similar, and there is detail everywhere. In the highlights, in the shadows, you can see very good. Now I could say that Canon has the same dynamic range as the Sony, but not really. In this situation, Canon lost by a lot. With this, the test finished. I hope you do enjoy it and saw the difference between them, and maybe with this you can see each system in what areas do triumph, and on your next Photoshop you will know on how to expose each system. I do love the dynamic range from the Sony, even though the lens is not that very good, but what can you do? So with this I will put a stop with the testing, because I kinda really did everything that I wanted to know. But of course you can also make a comment if you want to know something about the camera, or a test or something which I did not cover it, and I will try to answer it if I know it, or make a video about it if it does have an interest. I do hope you enjoy it and saw the difference between them. Do subscribe to my channel if you like this type of content, like this video, and share it to your friends to see if they wanna still switch system. So that's it with this video. I hope you have a good day, and bye bye.